This is Indian Country Today.
Thank you for joining us. I'm Mark Trahant. Let's take a minute to consider the President of the United States and a complicated history for the people indigenous to this land and to the governments that were here first. Presidents once spent a great deal of time thinking about Native people in this country. A century ago, the appointment of a federal government's Indian commissioner and local Indian agents was still a pretty big deal. Gradually, though, presidents spent less and less time thinking about American Indians. More and more policy was delegated to Congress, the courts, and the Interior Department. Still, when required, American Indians made great presidential props, especially when they dressed the part. Many years ago, I asked President George W. Bush about how he viewed tribal sovereignty.
Good morning. My name is Mark Trahant. I'm the editorial page editor of the Seattle Post-Intelligencer and a member of the Native American Journalists Association. Most school kids learn about government in the context of city, county, state, and federal. And of course, tribal governments are not part of that at all. Mr. President, you've been a governor and a president, so you have a unique experience looking at it from two directions. What do you think tribal sovereignty means in the 21st century, and how do we resolve conflicts between tribes and the federal and state governments?
Yeah. Tribal sovereignty means that it's sovereign. I mean, you've been given sovereignty, and you're viewed as a sovereign entity.
Okay.
And therefore, the relationship between the federal government and tribes is one between sovereign entities.
Think about this clip beyond its entertainment. What does it mean when a president is stumped by the question? More than that, if a president understands or misunderstands the role of tribal governments and sovereignty, how does that then filter down to the rest of the political system? Would a savvy president help Congress get it? The states? The citizens? Eventually, he got to the right answer. Sovereignty is sovereignty. But this topic is one of confusion to presidents. Ronald Reagan was challenged in Moscow, Russia, and he was far more confused than President Bush.
I didn't know that they had asked to see me if they've come here or whether to see them there. I'd be very happy to see them. Let me tell you just a little something about the American Indian in our land. We have provided millions of acres of land for what are called the preservations, or the reservations, I should say. They, from the beginning, announced that they wanted to maintain their way of life, as they had always lived there in the desert and the plains and so forth. And we set up these reservations so they could, and have a Bureau of Indian Affairs to help take care of them. At the same time, we provide education for them, schools on the reservations, and they are free also to leave the reservations and be American citizens among the rest of us, and many do. Some still prefer, however, that early way of life. And we've done everything we can to meet their demands as to how they want to live. Maybe we made a mistake. Maybe we should not have humored them in that wanting to stay in that kind of primitive lifestyle. Maybe we should have said, no, come join us, be citizens, along with the rest of us. As I say, many have been very successful. And I'm very pleased to meet with them, talk with them at any time, and see what their grievances are or what they feel they might be. You'd be surprised. Some of them became very wealthy because some of those reservations were overlaying great pools of oil, and you can get very rich pumping oil. And so I don't know what their complaint might be.
On this President's Day, perhaps it's worth considering what a country knows about its indigenous people. When we are children, most of us learn about city, county, state. But what we don't learn is how tribes fit into a national system. Treaties and tribal sovereignty are complicated concepts that we hear about later, most often in the press, in stories that involve conflict over jurisdiction, natural resources, or some other potent issue. Something to think about on this holiday. And those are the headlines from Indian Country Today. I'm Mark Trahant. We'll be right back.
This is Indian Country Today.
Who has a seat at the table? That impacts everything from public policy, corporate culture, and for tribes across the country, who controls their land? In this episode, we look at issues that impact the future and well-being of tribal nations through a sovereignty lens. In California, the site of one of the oldest and largest Ohlone villages is being threatened by developers. A proposed housing complex would destroy what's left of the village, which is the first place along the San Francisco Bay Area where people lived. Joining us today to talk about the cultural and archaeological significance of the site is Karina Gold. She's from the Confederated Villages of Lehan Ohlone. Christopher Dorr also joins us. He's an archaeologist who has helped the site gain eligibility for the National Register of Historic Places. It's called the West Berkeley Shell Mound.
Well, we're talking about 200 short years that we had first contact in our territory. And our ancestors were taking care of the land like indigenous people all over the world. We had a relationship and lived in reciprocity with the territories that we were on. You know, and the West Berkeley Shell Mound was the first place that my ancestors lived along the bay. We created our village sites and our shell mounds, our cemeteries, where salt water met fresh water. And so creeks were there, and there were fishing villages, and there were places. And so I imagine that my ancestors created these places because, like all of us, we're connected to the lands in different ways. But this particular site for our people was a site that actually connected us to the afterworld as well. This particular site, the West Berkeley Shell Mound, is connected to what people now call Alcatraz, where our ancestors, we believe, sat on that rock for 4 days while we had ceremony once they passed over. And at the time as the sun goes down, they would leave through our western gate on the fourth day, which is where the Golden Gate Bridge is. And so it's a part of our cosmology, our teachings, and really it's our responsibility as indigenous people from this territory to continue on the songs and dances that have happened for millennium. It's my responsibility to pass this on to the next generation. Living in the Bay Area, most of our sites are covered with asphalt and buildings, and our sacred landscapes are almost disappeared in the naked eye. And so it's important for us, not only as Lashawn people, to take up this site, but for people that now live in our territory to realize these amazing sacred places in their midst.
Dorr says the site is remarkable for many reasons.
So the National Register of Historic Places has 4 criteria by which you can become eligible for listing. And you only need to meet one of those criteria. And typically, any type of resource, it could be a building or it could be an archaeological site, typically meets 1 or 2 of those criteria. This site is the only site that I have ever worked on in my career that actually meets all 4 of those criteria. So it's extremely important, and important for a large number of different reasons. As well, the block that is scheduled for development that we're kind of talking about now, the site itself, the village site it touches parts of 8 blocks. So it's large in size. The development that's trying to happen covers one of those blocks. And that block happens to be a block that has, for the most part, never been built upon. There are a few structures known from historic maps in one corner of that block from the 19th century, but for the most part, that has remained unbuilt for forever. And it's the only block in that entire part of Berkeley that has never really been substantially built upon. So therefore, the value of those archaeological deposits for many different people, for the Ohlone, for archaeologists, for just the people in the community of Berkeley, very, very important.
When we come back, we'll hear about other ways tribes are regaining their traditional homeland. Land is the greatest resource for tribal nations across the country. 56 million acres are held in trust by the federal government for tribes. That's about 2% of the country. 90 million acres were taken by the U.S. between 1887 and 1934. For 8 years, Leech Lake Tribal Representative Leroy Fairbanks has been working on the return of Chippewa forest land to this Minnesota tribe.
It's called the Leech Lake Reservation Restoration Act. And what it did was return 11,760 acres of, it's Chippewa National Forest is what the national forest we have on Leech Lake. So it was in the United States Department of Agriculture, and it's transferring over to back to the Department of Interior. And so it's just kind of reversing what was done in the early 1940s to mid 1950s. And so at that time, there's a process called a secretarial transfer, where secretaries transfer title from one agency to another, and it was illegally done. And so they were not getting permission of the allottees or the heirs of these lands and this property. And it was happening, and it happened for so long, and then it ended in the mid 1950s. And so here we are 60, 70 years later, kind of correcting some of these historical wrongs that were happening. And for many that know the land issues in and around Leech Lake or northern Minnesota tribes, it was an effort by timber barons in getting access and taking down the beautiful trees and forests that we have here.
The Confederated Tribes of the Umatilla Reservation has had a multifaceted approach to land reclamation. Here's land manager Coco Hufford.
Well, Umatilla has a multiple approach for land acquisition. First, what we have done is that we've established an inheritance code, which has been adopted, and approved at the BIA level, which allows us to purchase from those that are non-enrolled here. And this is something that was started in 1998 and then re-established in 2008 with an amendment. And then what we do with not only the inheritance code, we try to, and Chris and Indian Land Tenure Foundation has been supportive, is that we do estate planning, will writing, gift deeds. And then what we have is the next component is we have a land acquisition strategy, which because we had progressive Board of Trustees members who thought ahead, leadership that thought ahead, we decided that because of our checkerboard situation, because of the Allotment Act, that we needed to buy those parcels that we didn't own, not only by non-Indians, but Indians from other reservations. And then our other approach has been because of the land buyback program, Department of Interior's program, them coming in and assisting us in 2015 and 2018. We continue to actively go out and look for properties and establish criteria every year for what we need and where we want to go with it. So it's a multiple approach, and it's an approach that we take, and our board approves every year and provides us. Our board of trustees provides us money up to $1 million, million plus every year to be able to do this acquisition process.
Chris Stainbrook is president of the Indian Land Tenure Foundation, who helps leverage resources to help tribes reclaim land.
There has been a major push over the last 20 years to really reacquire land that was alienated, particularly on reservation, but also the cultural sites. And we really saw that ramping up in the last few years as the tribes have had more resources, both from gaming and from the land buyback program that Coco mentioned. Those lands get leased and those revenues come into the tribal coffers, and there's more land, more capital available for acquiring land. The other thing we've seen is non-Indians beginning to take an interest in returning land to Indian people and the tribes. And we see various contributions of land, not always big tracts of land, but important tracts of land. So cultural sites, some of the religious sites that the tribes still hold an interest in. At the same time, there are pressures, and particularly now that we've had the virus around Indian country, Those pressures have kind of slowed the progress, if you will, but we still see it going on. We see pressures on some of the religious institutions to return the land on reservations that they were given early on. And I think it's important that examples like Umatilla and Leech Lake are out there so people can see that it's not howling at the moon, it's actually happening. And you just have to put a plan together and move toward it. We're working with a village in Alaska right now, Taslina, that's trying to get land back from the Catholic Church. It was a boarding school for a long time. It was a polluted site, and the Catholic Church was forced to clean it up. And they would like to get paid at least the amount of cleanup that they did. We see those types of things. We see counties and cities starting to say, perhaps, we should return this land. In 2008, we helped a county in Washington State give a county park to a tribe. The tribe didn't have the funds to really maintain the park. And so we bought them a pickup truck and a lawnmower, and they got the land back in tribal ownership, and they've done well with it. But we're seeing that across the board.
That was Leroy Fairbanks, Coco Hufford, and Chris Stainbrook. Rebecca Adamson has had a seat on the board, a corporate board, but few Native Americans serve on these powerful boards. A new California law will change that. I asked her what kind of corporations would benefit most for having a Native presence in the boardroom.
Well, the ones that should be are the extractive industries, because they really have, we proved with DAPL, the brilliance out at DAPL and the activists and the tribes and the voice that was heard at DAPL really proved the risk behind operating on indigenous lands without any skill set there to advise you. When we reviewed the companies, there was absolutely only 2 companies of the 52 extractive companies in the US that even had a social committee that would look at this kind of risk. And yet Energy Transfer Partners stock lost 60% of its value because of the social risk by ignoring indigenous rights. I also think that any industry that's working on land-based utilities, agriculture, transportation, those really need to look at indigenous expertise. But even beyond that, fashion industry, we've seen cultural appropriation in the fashion industry. Dolce & Gabbana just really went up against the wall when they really blew it in China with their last supposedly fashion show. I mean, it would be a better question to say who wouldn't benefit by having an indigenous people and expertise, experience, and our values at the table. And so that's where this happens, and that's where we have to be. I went on there, and once we did what became community notes, and over the first 10 years, it raised $2 billion in community notes, investing into low income. That all came out of indigenous thinking right from the Lakota Fund. Then I was able to really focus on indigenous people's rights, and I created the first indigenous people's investment screen. I compiled all of our declarations of rights into a set of criteria for investors. And by 1999, it was becoming the first indigenous people's investment screen and helping investors select companies that were upholding our rights or avoiding those that weren't. Since that, I also went out and trained 600 brokers on the screen. We get pushback in weird places. We had the environmentalists saying, oh, we cover indigenous people under our environment screens. We had human rights saying they covered indigenous people under the human rights. It didn't include our intellectual property. It didn't include our culture. It didn't include self-determinations. So it's just key. And it was because an Indian person was there that it was able to really address those things that are so crucial to us, like self-determination. So we have to have some kind of unified way to look at board diversity with Indian country being part of that equation.
Thanks, Rebecca. We'll be back to bring context through an indigenous lens. In 1969, 89 American Indians occupied land near San Francisco. For 19 months, Alcatraz Island was reclaimed by Native people until they were forcibly removed by the U.S. government. Interactions between Native protesters have historically been much different than what we saw happen at the January 6th insurgents at our nation's capital. The 10-month encampment at the Standing Rock Reservation against the Dakota Access Pipeline saw violent confrontations from law enforcement. Some Black Lives Matter protests have been met with violence as well. We turn to a scholar of Alcatraz to compare these events. Osage citizen and professor Robert Warrior joins us. He's a distinguished professor of American literature and culture at the University of Kansas, and he's the co-author of the book, Like a Hurricane, the Indian Movement from Alcatraz to Wounded Knee.
One thing about Alcatraz is that sense, I think, of its brilliance, of the idea that there's a real sense that whoever thought of this was thinking of something that was going to last in memory for a long, long time. And that whatever else you say about it, that it seemed not well organized, or it seemed as though it was really pursuing kind of aims that were not really possible. Why would you have a community center out on an island, as we wrote in Like a Hurricane so many years ago? Why would you want to have a community center that you had to get to by boat when most of the people in your community take the bus? And so there's a way in which that spontaneity and the brightness of it, the brilliance of it that emerges suddenly changes things. And I think that that's one of the things that we're all doing right now with what happened in DC last week, is seeing that we thought we were coming out of something with the Trump administration ending, but I don't know that people thought that this would be entering into a new watershed moment. And it seems like that's a real possibility here of what's going on in 2021, is that sense that we don't know what's going to happen next. And I think that that's a real similarity with Alcatraz as well. There was suddenly a quality in the Native world that people couldn't just dismiss something. Oh, those are a bunch of urban Indians. Oh, that's a bunch of people who are discontent. But when you see that much attention, when you see it also not so much even just the attention in the mainstream media, but that it speaks to young people, that it speaks to people who are not being spoken to people who feel disenfranchised, that's a really powerful dynamic to let loose into a world. And I think that that's the main contribution of what happened with Alcatraz.
That was Robert Warrior, an Alcatraz scholar and a professor at the University of Kansas. Ketsamini Fox is Bear Clan from the Mohawk Nation. She is an artist, filmmaker, and educator. The installment of The People takes you on a journey with Junie as she creates pottery based on her people's ancient culture. And that's a slice of life from Indian Country Today. Thanks for joining us.
Indian Country Today is recorded at the Phoenix Indian School Visitor Center in Phoenix, Arizona.
This is Indian Country Today.